So good evening and welcome to the 2022 Jean Whyte Lecture. Before we begin anything, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. The traditional owners of this land are the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay our respects on behalf of the panel to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also to any First Nations people in the audience or online. So this is a hybrid event. We have a much larger audience, I'm told, online than in person, but it's so wonderful to be here for the first time in 3 years in person, but also lovely to be able to welcome our online colleagues. This year's Whyte Lecture, well, perhaps before I start on that, I should tell you a little bit about the Whyte Lecture. The Whyte Lecture was created as part of the Monash University faculty continuing contribution of Professor Jean Whyte. And Professor Jean Whyte was Foundation Professor of Librarianship at Monash University and the inaugural Professor of the Monash Graduate School of Librarianship, which is now part of the Faculty of Information Technology. She was instrumental in establishing a master's course in librarianship and archives and records, building a strong PhD and Masters by Research program, and developing Monash's research program and profile in those fields. She was the founder of the Ancora Press at Monash University, and the press has published a number of scholarly publications relating to librarianship, archives and records. The Whyte Fund, which is part of what we honour here, is a bequest from Professor Jean Whyte to support research in archives and records and librarianship. And her bequest was supplemented, I guess, by a bequest from her sister. So we'd like just to acknowledge that also, Phyllis Whyte. So this year's Whyte Lecture remembers the contributions of Dr. Frank Upwood, who died in July 2021 during the pandemic years. Frank was my friend and my colleague for over 40 years, and I get really scared when I count those years. But in keeping with the connection with Jean Whyte, Frank was in fact commissioned by Jean Whyte to develop the business case for establishing the first archives and records course at Monash way back in the 1980s, and then was appointed the first teacher in the archives and records stream, from which position he then recruited our wonderful colleagues, Professor Sue McKemish and Dr. Livia Iacovino, close colleagues and collaborators with Frank. Although Frank's published work is not particularly prolific, when he did publish, what he published tended to make a bang and an explosion rather than a kind of gentle disappearance into the ether. And his best known contribution to our professional discourse was the development of the records continuum model and theory. And this set of writing focuses around what Frank called the quadrility of structure. Only Frank could call it the quadrility of structure, a word that doesn't actually exist. And those, for those of you who are familiar with the model, they're the dimensions of the continuum: create, capture, organise and pluralise, each representing a specific aspect of concern for practice and theory. And that representation of the records continuum is probably most familiar to people through the model, the target model, for want of a better word, which identifies those cascading regions of action and influence transected by axes. And for the records and archives profession, the axes are evidence, identity, transactions, and record-keeping containers. His theory had a huge impact nationally and internationally, and it provided a conceptual base for the profession from which to organise record-keeping in a whole host of environments, and not necessarily the ones that it's restricted to these days. Multiple contexts, and particularly relevant to thinking into the digital world. Frank conceptualised the impact of space-time and was particularly concerned to bring the past to the present and link the present to the future, with the present being the still point in a continuing ripple of movement and interpretation. Frank's impact can be seen directly on and indirectly on record-keeping standards, on professional practice, and on the scholars who followed in his research directions. He continued working well beyond his retirement from Monash, and he worked on concepts of record-keeping informatics, but more importantly, his advocacy, certainly in later years, was to identify that the quadrality of structure, Frank's phrase, applies to all information in all areas, so it transcends disciplines. And to that end, he developed a whole range of models with different axes suited to different disciplines to identify the particular points of interaction that the disciplines might wish to pursue. So you'll find in Frank's writings a data continuum model, a forensic evidence model, a cultural context model, a whole lot of different ways of thinking about it, but all aimed at professing to a larger information base, that this way of analysing information and the behaviour of information in multiple contexts has got far-reaching implications. We thought about this panel and we thought about what we would like to do with this panel, and Frank liked to look forward and he loved interaction with younger scholars and taking a very encouraging view of his work and the role of scholarship. And to that end, we have decided this year not to look back and kind of reflect on Frank's illustrious past. That's it. That's all we're going to get from me on Frank's illustrious past, but rather to look at the next generation of scholars and how they have been using and interpreting his work. And it's that next generation of scholars that are represented here on this panel. We have 4 Monash FIT graduates, or about to be graduates, all of which outrank me academically by a long shot. But each of them has used and interpreted and developed Frank's work, which I think he would have loved. So let me introduce you to the panel, and then I'll pass over. So we'll do the introductions in one block so as not to interrupt the flow. So, and this is in order of the speakers. So the first speaker will be Dr. Elizabeth Daniels. Elizabeth Daniels is a Melbourne-based archivist working at the University of La Trobe and Good Shepherd. Her doctoral thesis focused heavily on the work of Frank Upwood and continuum theory more broadly. She has a strong interest in all things theoretical and possibilities created by taking a continuum approach to archives and record keeping. Catherine Jarvey will be our next speaker, and Catherine is a final year PhD candidate at Monash University. She's worked with archives in Australia since 2003 and is currently an associate director at RMIT Libraries. Catherine is an editorial board member of the Archives and Records Journal and past editor of Archives and Manuscripts. Dr. Lisa Gibbons. Dr. Lisa Gibbons has a 15-year career in records and information professions, including experience in corporate, academic, government and community environments. In all her roles, Lisa seeks to learn more about how people, including archivists, good to know that they're not excluded, understand and value archives as memory and evidence. And our final speaker will be Dr. Greg Rowland. Following decades as an IT practitioner, Greg returned to study at Monash University, gaining a PhD in record-keeping informatics. His work resulted in the participatory record-keeping continuum model, a new metadata meta model, and a proof of concept of participatory record-keeping architecture. He then applied this work in the Rights in Records by Design project, working with care leavers and their records. Greg now works in the Monash ALAX lab, the AI for Law Enforcement and Community Safety lab at Monash, building infrastructure that supports data collection rights, consent, and access. So with that, I'd like to pass over to Liz.
Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Well, as you already know, Barbara has kindly introduced me. And unlike some of my colleagues here, I never had the pleasure of a close personal relationship with Frank. But throughout my thesis, I was very close to Frank's writing and his thinking. So I guess that's what I'll be reflecting on a little bit here. I was very stumped in writing this talk. It turned into a lecture on continuum theory, which no one wants or needs right now. It then turned into why theory is important. Again, I think we all know why theory is important. And then it turned almost into a talk just on monistic diversity, which is another wonderful Frankism, if we can use that term. At the end of the day, I ended up with a bit of a combination of all of those things, so I hope you bear with me. So one of the things I really appreciate about Frank is he didn't feel the need to spend a lot of time justifying why he was writing theory. And it feels like a lot of us feel the need to do that, and often we are questioned on why. You know, just get it on the shelf, just get it processed, just get it done, get it done. And I think for Frank, he started off at the Australian Archives, so he started off as a practitioner, then he was theorising his own practice, so perhaps that gave him that comfort to just dive right in there. And many people, I've had many different responses to records continuum theory, some good, some very much not so good. And many people argue that his work isn't practical. And perhaps that's true, perhaps not, but I think it's certainly pragmatic. While records continuum theory was and still is very much a group endeavour, Frank sat at its theoretical heart. I feel that his work is challenging because it does not deliver simple answers or instructions. It is not prescriptive, it's not a manual, it's not an instruction booklet. It wouldn't tell you how to process a box sitting in front of you. That's just not what it's meant to do. Instead, it provides a perspective through which to view the world so that whatever box you come across, you can process it. And I think the reason for this, for it being a perspective, is a very pragmatic one, and that's that we can't know what's going to be in any of the boxes we come across. We can't know what format records are going to be in. We can't know what format the systems will be. We can't know what the content will be. We can't know with any certainty who it will be significant to. So what we can do, and I think what Frank gave us a tool to help us do, is look back and reflect on what has led to good record keeping in the past. And a way of doing that is focusing in on that relationship between record keeping and society. For me, that explains the turn to sociology and philosophy as a way to deal with this really complex problem. So rather than focusing on things we know will be in constant flux, like records formats or content, records continuum theory focuses on functions that records represent. Because odds are records in whatever form, will be representing something. That's one of those few certainties that we've got. And I know there are possibly arguments coming in, well, what if the functions change, Liz? Because they can change too. And our understanding of them does change over time, and that's okay. because Frank talked about the flicker. And his concept of the flicker was records as this artificial freezing of a single moment in time from a single perspective. And this is why the records continuum model, which some people find a bit scary, has so many dimensions and so many axes. It's an acknowledgement of the many perspectives from which a record can be examined and made sense of, for the many functions that may emerge and morph over time. So rather than focusing on nailing down fixed descriptions and provenance relationships, his work has a focus on documenting networks of fluid contexts that can be added to over time. He created a tool to help us position ourselves and to observe records from different perspectives, the records continuum model. I didn't know this until about halfway through my PhD, but it completely changed how I understood Frank's work, and that is that the model is actually a topographic map. So if you think about MLways or something like that, if you look at a mountain, there are the contour lines all around it, and that's what the dimensions are. Okay, so it's not that the records are moving from one to the other, to the other, to the other. You are moving from one to the other, to the other, to the other. It's giving you points to ground yourself from which to further explore. And it gives us questions as archivists that we can ask. So on the identity axis, we can ask questions like, well, who created it? Who is it about? Rather than setting in stone a single creator. We are then free to choose which questions are most useful to us in our own contexts, because we can't do all of it. It's not possible, and that's okay. And I think that's perhaps where another point of tension often lies with Frank's work, is people say, well, yeah, but we can never do all that. And it's okay. It allows you to look at things from alternative perspectives and then justify why you have selected to focus on a certain perspective. And his approach emphasises that inherent incompleteness of all records and reassures us, or at least reassures me, that we don't need to panic because there's never going to be a perfect process or a perfect archive. We just need to be transparent about the perspective that we're taking.
Barbara was saying how supportive Frank was of all of the young people. I don't know if I'm on. Hello, hello? Frank was very supportive of young people, and when I first met him at the time, can you hear me now? No. Hello, hello. That's better. Thank you. So, Barbara was saying how supportive Frank was of young people, and I met him during my master's in the classroom for the first time, and it was such a bizarre feeling because somebody that was in the journals I could see in real life in the class. It was so bizarre and so exciting and intimidating, but over time it became less intimidating and more exciting, especially getting opportunities that I have through Monash and my fellow archivists and Society of Archivists colleagues editing the journal Archives and Manuscripts during that time of my master's. I had to edit Frank's work as well as Barbara's, Sue McKemish, and I was so scared. It was so intimidating. And just learning the basics that we take for granted now, the word address. Someone said to me, oh, Eric Ketelaar's address, we should publish that in Archives and Manuscripts. And I said, he won't want his private information, his home address, put into Archives and Manuscripts. So I had a way to go. Since a 23-year-old girl, Frank, Barbara and Sue McKemish have all really supported my growth throughout my time at Monash. And I was particularly inspired by Frank in the classroom because he actually published one of my assignments from the class in Archives and Manuscripts. It was on the Cultural Heritage Continuum model. And I'll let Lisa speak to that because I know it inspired her work too. And it's amazing how something that you write inspires others and flows on, because I'm really happy that my work did that for Lisa, and Frank's does that for each of us here. So it's really fantastic. That particular assignment was on eBay as a cultural heritage container, something that was, talking about appraisal and how we appraise records, whether they're an object or a document, something that was quite, I guess, controversial. I like being controversial. I talk about radical record keeping, so if you haven't read my work, I like to think about the radical. And so did Frank. And that's, I think, what inspired me to shake things up. The way that he disrupted the norms by using the continuum model and got us to rethink our traditional ways of doing archives, I think really has led into my current work of thinking about Facebook as, doing nanosecond archiving and archiving by activists in spaces online. I hadn't read back my assignment from when Frank visited, but it has really influenced me even into my current PhD and my work with animal activists at the moment, and how they're record keeping online and creating their communities legitimately in their own spaces, in those social media spaces. So, like I mentioned, Barbara and Frank, they always supported us at Monash to take charge and speak up, and it took years and years for me to get confident to speak, so I appreciate them thrusting us into the limelight. I had to MC the the continuum informatics workshops, which Frank was very keen to see go global, and that was really exciting. We got to go to Sydney and then South Korea, and he was really keen to take informatics global. And I was really, the enthusiasm really rubbed off on everybody he was around. And something he said about those workshops is that, we can focus on the pragmatism. He was very keen that, as Liz mentioned, that transcendental pragmatism was what he wanted with continuum informatics, that transcendental being disruptive or transformative, and he was okay in those workshops to focus on the pragmatic. And I think we've taken that idea of disruption and transformation, I know I have, and the panellists here have taken that critical continuum approach of transforming things in ways that affect social good. And I think that's inspired by Frank. He wanted to, it wasn't only a model, he wanted that model to be tested against real life scenarios, as has been done by a number of us at Monash, and making that theoretical practical is really something I hope to do in my research for animal activists, to turn what is a records disposal authority for organisations, for how can that translate to a continuum version of deciding value according to justice and activist values, which is quite different to, I guess, just traditional RDA. So that's how Frank's work is translated into mine.
Working? It is, isn't? Oh. It's too much information. I'll give you that. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Catherine. And thanks, Liz. And future thanks to you, Greg. So we live in a continuum. I am going to build on both of those two things. Unfortunately for me, I didn't get to be taught directly in my master's by Frank. The year I came in was the year he retired. But I did snaffle him up as a supervisor for my PhD. So my PhD I started in 2008, and it lasted for an epic 6.5 years. So during that time, I had the opportunity to have a very, very, very long conversation with Frank as my supervisor, fortunately. So over the years, we explored continuum thinking and knowing. We went over continuum implementation and confusion, and discussed an interlacing past and present of continuum thought. Now, I lived in various places over this time, and he would get on a train and come and visit me. Have Mikey will travel, I noted in one of the emails that I opened up to think about this talk. And he would come visit me in Ballarat. We would sit in the cafe near the train station, and I have no idea what those people thought we were talking about, but they should have been listening, I think, anyway. So these conversations helped me understand an epistemology of continuum thinking, how continuum thinking is formed as knowledge and how we could know it as a valid knowledge. And I think that was pretty hard work, actually, and it took, that's why it probably took 6.5 years. So what I want to do is a couple of reflections in relation to this work that we did. I want to fast forward to 2017 and the last communications I had with Frank. And this was in relation to his entry in the Encyclopedia of Archival Writers. In the draft entry, which he and I worked together on, Frank said that I helped sharpen connections between space-time continuum models, cultural heritage, and the digital rhizome. In true Frank way, he did not explain what the digital rhizome was. He assumed you knew what it was, and I think it's pretty self-evident, following on from Frank. But I can talk about it later if you want, okay? So this sentence highlights at least one important feature of how Frank thought and worked as a scholar and his influence on me, and that's what I want to share with you. So this feature is the notion of recommencing. So this kind of idea of recursive or becoming, it features in Frank and Sue's work and everybody really to do with the continuum. And the term recommencing came up in my email conversations. It's one of the very first terms that we had a conversation about. So recommencing in Frank's hands was to acknowledge and describe an evolution of knowledge and knowing. Recommencing was always about acknowledging the past in the present, and it is a call to the future. Frank's work was influenced by many, and in turn he was influenced by us, or so he says. The new continuum thinkers we see here today. He saw our work as a continuation of what came before, and he positioned himself within that continuum. So now I'm going to jump, in true continuum style, to 2012. I professed in an email to my supervisors that I was conflicted about the use of the terms continuum theory versus continuum thinking. I was already examining how all the continuum models created by Frank, which have been talked about by Barbara, plus including the ones he co-created with others, how they all work together. I was getting caught up with academic structures around how to define theory, and it was really winding me up. Frank responded to my fraught email saying that he used the term continuum theory loosely, positioning it within metaphysics. Frank wrote, and I quote, "Continuum thinking is not simply a label, it is a fundamental way of viewing the world around us." It was after this email I came to realise that it was incredibly important for me to identify as a continuum theorist, working at a highly abstract level. It finally dawned on me that continuum thinking, or theory, is a way of knowing, understanding and interpreting. It is a philosophy, not just theory. This insight radically shifted my approach to my research, and I positioned the continuum as a worldview that influenced the entire research design. In 2017, in that 2017 encyclopedia entry, Frank acknowledged this in his recommencing style by writing, and I quote, "Upward followed Gibbons in beginning to treat the continuum epistemology as a rhizome." Again, not explaining rhizome. Today, I follow this way of thinking and deploy continuum thinking in the way that I work in my current job at the State Records Office of Western Australia, a role that I find richly rewarding. So I want to end the short reflection by acknowledging that in true Frank style, there is a lot to unpack in both those quotes that I shared, apart from definitions. I can take questions, but also anticipate we're going to hopefully get a chance to explore some of those ideas tonight. Thank you.
Am I live? Yes, okay. I'm on. So, elephant in the room. I found much of Frank's writing difficult. Not as impenetrable as the usually French postmodernist crowd from which he drew, but often a slog. And not the ideas, just the way he expressed them. It was left to those such as Sue and Barbara and Livia and us, I guess, and others to translate his work. Hats off to Kath. I think that his work has been described as uneditable. So there you go. But I get it. Explaining paradigm shifts is hard, especially if you're expected to couch your explanations in terms of the old, when you draw upon ideas from other disciplines, and when your conclusions challenge the status quo. But I'm always telling my students, don't force the reader to join the dots. Take the reader by the hand and lead them through the argument. But Frank didn't have many dots. No Hansel and Gretel trail of breadcrumbs from him. More like allusions to ideas, snatches of references to the tips of philosophical icebergs. The reader has to work at pulling it all together, dig into the allusions and references, find the connections, do the hard yards. It's actually quite a contrast between the generous teacher, have Mikey will travel, between the generous teacher and the disinclined writer. I'm not sure whether it was a deliberate pedagogical technique or whether it was just obvious to him, all in front of us, there for the taking. And as an academic, Frank had to write in scholarly publications and in scholarly forms. And his work was in a scholarly form, in the same way that the works of Bosch or Dali have artistic form. But when you look deeply, things are not what you might have presupposed. Conventional forms were subverted, as was the language. The language, as we've talked about. The language with its penchant for repurposing or making up words. Words that made us think. Words to break out of paradigmatic straitjackets. This was his simplexity. Seemingly straightforward sentences that were, as I said, the tips of icebergs. And, speaking about escaping straitjackets, for me, that was Frank's greatest gift to us. After more than a century of turn-by-turn directions down the byways of records management, disposal schedules, and sentencing and appraisal and preservation, he gave us the ability to make maps and ask questions like, where are we? Where do we want to be? How do we know when we get there? Where be dragons? And I use this map analogy deliberately because of Frank's interest concerning the topology, the underlying shape of the structuration of information in society. And topology, as opposed to topography, which are the contours of a particular system or practice or institution. Frank showed us that if you understand the topology, you can in effect shift from one topography to another. You could go somewhere else. And more importantly, you could conceive of other somewheres, other systems, other societal forms, other ways of doing information. It took me a long time to get this. And apologies if you've heard this tale before, but as I was working on my PhD, I asked Frank to look over the continuum model that I was publishing. I think I was the first to base the model on dimensions entirely different from create, capture, and so on. He gave me some critical feedback and pointed out that I'd somehow merged my topology with a particular system's topography. Well, as an arrogant PhD student, I shrugged it off and published and graduated and moved on. But Frank's critique didn't sit well with me. And as the years passed, I kept turning his words over until much, much later it came to me. Frank was absolutely right. I had confused the two. The only insight I had was actually how I made that mistake. And I wish that I could have been able to have that conversation with him. So maybe that was the root of difficulties with his scholarly writing style. We were wanting the turn-by-turn directions, the breadcrumbs and the hand-holding. And he was there thinking on a different topological plane entirely, imagining other somewheres. Not so much a problem of him fitting in, but a problem of us keeping up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you. We have, as is inevitable, overstepped time. We do want to leave some time for questions, but I'm going to ask your indulgence to take a little bit more time to pose some questions to our panel. I trust that's okay with you. So the first question I'd like to pose to Catherine is, was Frank a scholarly or unscholarly misfit? The title of this lecture.
Well, he called himself an unscholarly misfit, so that's where we had a debate about whether that was true or not. And he said that back in 1990. I actually found it going through his thoughts about appraisal, and that was an appraising computer-based records back in 1990. And his ideas about appraisal was that it was a fanciful approach, he said, a soft approach about understanding the person rather than the record as a thing to appraise, which really resonated with me. And in a human-centred computing group now, in 2022, was ahead of his time, I think. And so while he might have found himself unscholarly at the time, I think decades later he might have conceded to being scholarly. I know myself, I was shaky in my first presentations, and now I concede to be scholarly too. But I think he liked to shake things up and challenge convention. So the fact that he maybe wanted to be unscholarly and shake the academe a bit is something that has translated through to transformative justice that Greg, Joanne Evans and others like Suma Kemish have spoken about, and taking us on a path to challenge concepts like disciplinarity and what is post-disciplinarity, and we could really go down the path of shaking things up for the university. As well, I went to Monash Prato and I played Sound of Silence for one of my first presentations, which was quite unscholarly, I think, for the audience to hear some music at the start of my presentation. But by being a scholarly misfit, we need to shake things up, and that transformation and transformative justice, I think, is something you need to be, and maybe being unscholarly is very scholarly in the end too, because if you think of our friends like Frank Golding, the care leavers from the Care Leavers Network, he says you can't be given rights, you have to go and take them. You have to really do the work and shake things up a bit to get the rights you need. So maybe you do need to be unscholarly to be scholarly.
Would anyone else like to comment on that? Or?
I think when we had this conversation about scholarly, I went and looked it up. And what does it mean? It means to kind of interrogate something in a way that is, approaching rigour or making sure that you're investigating something thoroughly. And when we had our pre-meeting, because I've been trawling my email, I found some of the work that Frank had shared with me, where he had done investigations into archaeology of knowledge, and how he actually did that, how he created a discursive map of the ideas in that book is scholarly. I think he was always trying to drill to the the ideas, as much as he liked to make up terms that were the ideas, but he was always trying to bring those up into the light in a way. And something else that sort of came to me recently about the scholarly nature of it is that he was always interrogating himself as well, and I think that's part of what we do as scholars or scholarly thinking, and that's what our conversations were about. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. Catherine? So Frank considered his work on space-time informatics and the archival continuum to be overshadowed by his 1990 work on the records continuum. What do you think? I'm going to throw to Greg.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, my undergrad is in applied physics, so I can talk about space-time continua a little bit. Yeah, look, I think that's the case, and I think to a certain extent the records continuum model is one manifestation of the underlying, it's what I was kind of talking about topologies before. The whole idea of continua, as I think Liz was saying, you know, it's us that are moving, and it's moving against some sort of frame of reference, and this is all sounding very sort of ethereal, I guess. But the core thing, I think, is you pick some sort of framework, whether it's space-time or other dimensionalities, and you think about distantiation within that framework. The records continuum model is sense-making as you move away from the space-time instance of perhaps creating a record. My continuum model is on a different distantiation of the way, moving away from when people interact with a particular activity. So I think the fundamental, for me anyway, the fundamental contribution is in this idea of dimensionalities and distantiation and the space-time stuff. Of course, the records continuum model is you know, incredibly useful, and it's proven itself over and over again as a body of theory that actually is one of the stronger, I think, information systems theories we have, as it is testable and predictive and all of that kind of thing. So yes, I think it is overshadowed, but I think if you dig in, the fundamental truth of the space-time stuff is actually the power that drives the models.
Thanks, Greg. Liz, when we were discussing this presentation, I think Catherine came up with the wonderful analogy that the model, which is the superficial representation of the depth of Frank's work, it's really like a TARDIS. It's much bigger on the inside than it appears to be. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, and I guess following on from what Greg said, I often feel that there is a bit of confusion between the model and the theory. So the model is one example of the theory. And in teaching the model, I think really you've got to start with the theory. If you don't understand the theory, the model is just terrifying. So in that sense, it's a two-dimensional representation of a particular way of relating to the world.
Thanks, Liz.
And I guess the thing is, every time you interrogate the model, you come from a different perspective, so you find new things. So that's the TARDISness.
Yeah.
TARDISness? Frank's rubbing off. I'm making up words here.
Yeah, I guess that it's almost like people. One of the hardest things I found teaching, I don't know about other people here, is trying to communicate concepts through examples, because often people or students will pick up on the example and they'll latch onto the example rather than the concept. And so for me, the records continuum model is an example of how you can use this thinking. It's not the concept itself.
And the kind of fill in the blanks approach is absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. That's absolutely not the way to approach this very deep, conceptual, abstract approach. But Lisa, there's a lot of unresolved issues, or issues that could be further explored, room to move in this debate, in opening up this theory. Would you like to speculate on some of those that you think would assist us all, and perhaps more broadly to the information professions?
That's a big ask. Okay, I'll give it a go. So, from the story that I talked about, I was talking about the continuum as a way of knowing and how we understand how that is a way of knowing. And Liz, talked about how we might communicate the concepts. And, Greg talked about the idea of it being I don't know. Reflecting back a bit, but the idea of the model being part of or is an instance. So both talked about that, and Catherine talked a little bit about the way that it's been applied over the last few years. And so some of the work that I was thinking about, and this is what Greg had mentioned about information systems theory and the robustness of it, was trying to pull out and draw the theory of it and make it, sort of give it a clarification. All the models, there's loads of them now, from us on the stage here, as well as people from overseas. People have used it in different ways and interpreted it in different ways. And all of these perspectives tell a story about how people think about the models and the theory. And to me, I think that there's an opportunity there to explore or build the language of the theory a lot more. But the other aspect, of course, is how we apply it, and it's being applied in really amazing ways. And I think the opportunity too, one of the things with Joanne Evans's work is how it crosses from theory into practice, and the real life implications of that with the care leavers, children in care, and the record keeping to do with that. Yeah.
So I think, sorry, Greg.
Just really quickly, I think there are too many models, and my thoughts tend to lean towards the unified field theory, and that's the physicist symmetry in me coming out. That I think that there are heretofore undiscovered links between the models, and it's to do with the dimensionality and other things. But this isn't the place to talk about that. But I think there's some theoretical work to be done on thinking about those models.
The models are almost fractals of one another. Like it's yeah.
So Frank was very much about pattern recognition and pattern finding. And it's my view, not that anyone's asked my view, but my view, to just tell you anyway, is that the multiple models are attempts to communicate the richness of what he was trying to do to multiple disciplines. And I feel, unfortunately, that people have diluted or misunderstood what those models were intended for, which was, as my interpretation is, it's a communication vehicle to explore and widen the impact of the thinking.
In his thesis, one of the kind of proto-models that I found fascinating, it's just a table. And it's got 3 columns, and in one column it's challenging binaries and just looking for what's in between. So you've got a column with record and a column with archive, and that's it. And that is a continuum model because it's about that perspective shifting and exploring and creating.
What I've been playing with is different worldviews across one model. So for animal activists, what they're doing is animal justice, whereas to police, it's a criminal act. So on the same model, you've got different worldviews imposed on the one activity. So what Chris Hurley might have called irreconcilable ontologies, how do you put... to date, we've really only been looking at one worldview per model. What can we do if we overlay different worldviews on the one model?
Parallel logics.
Look, with that, I think I'm over time to throw to questions, both from the audience present and also acknowledging that we have a much larger audience online. Are there any questions that you would like to pose, or perhaps statements, but mainly questions, for our panellists around any of their presentations or statements? We can go on for hours.
Back next week for part 2.
So
Frank was keen on a part 2 as well.
He was a big man for part 2. Are there any questions online? Okay. Well, perhaps I can go back to some of the things that you've raised. I mean, do you think that this, trying to actually articulate this to a different audience? So, Catherine, we had the experience of talking in South Korea, for example, this model and the thinking resonates with young scholars, much less so perhaps with practitioners that are very set in their ways. Do you think and the other thing I think I want to throw into that is literature tends to fade away with time, and keeping this literature, which I would argue is really before its time, or before much of our colleagues were ready to think in these ways. How do you keep that discourse available to the current generation, and does it still have relevance? And that I'm going to throw that open to everybody.
Well, from record-keeping informatics, nanosecond archiving really resonated with me and the work I've been doing with activists, because they're on Facebook videoing an event or a protest, and it's going across all different dimensions of the records continuum. It's being archived in a second, and archived by, I mean, on the internet, which we could go on for a bit more about how much the internet is an archive. But so there are definitely resonances that can be taken on by scholars, and as long as we keep talking about it, then it's going to continue to grow and grow into new things.
One of the things that I experienced when I would go to the Archival Education and Research Institute is the adoration of Frank. And I haven't been for a number of years now, but people were speechless and unclear about whether they could even approach him. He had that kind of elevation. And I wonder, and I wish I should have asked, why? Because we didn't think like that necessarily, although, he was pretty special. But did they read his work, and that's what was the trigger for that kind of level of adoration? How were they using or thinking about his work in their own? Because there's an institute that has beginning PhD students, really. I wondered about why that happened like that, and I'm not sure I have the answers for that. But those kind of forums are the places that we can help, build and continue to build. I mean, there's certainly a legacy, and it comes through us and the work that we do. It comes through the record-keeping standards and the work that's done there as well. But considering how hard it's been for me as an academic to get people to read Frank's 2 seminal papers, it's not something I had to read them when I went to Monash. So you should have to read them. So I also taught continuum by stealth as an approach. So taught ways of thinking over a semester, and then went, surprise, you learned continuum theory. And so I don't think I've got any sort of answers for that. And now I'm out of the sort of academic world. I feel like the work that I do is to show it in practice, and to inform my practice about that.
I guess this is, again, just an observation that I had in one of the pre-talk meetings, and that's when, if you're not someone with Frank's standing and you ask the kind of questions Frank asked, you look really, really stupid. Because he spent a lot of time really interrogating what core concepts mean. And people don't tend to like that very much when you're going up and saying, well, what do you actually mean by disposal? How? Why this way and not that way? And yeah, I think there's this interesting almost osmosis of Frank's work. So I've had conversations with people who would say, oh, we won't worry about the theory, we'll just follow the standards. Which is a bit ironic because the standards are built around Frank's theory. So it's there is a lot of continuum by stealth, and I guess perhaps that's why I always felt with my students that I needed to start off with the higher level theory, because it contextualizes. It gives you a reason why you are asking these annoying questions.
In my own experience is that I told stories, and people would say to me afterwards, great story, but what's it got to do with? And you think, okay.
So this is a bit of a different perspective. There's an argument to be made that, in fact, now is the body of work. Its time has come now. A lot of the early work was done with the sort of impending digital revolution, and I think that the promise of the digital revolution didn't hold. I think that a lot of the work that was done was essentially systems emulating paper, fast paper. But what's different now, and this is directly due with the work I'm doing, so I guess maybe I'm biased. So I work in a lab where we're building artificial intelligence engines for law enforcement in particular. And there's a huge problem about the curation of data that feeds into building models, that build into inferences that become part of decision-making systems. And now there's a concern about the provenance of some of these decisions that are being made. And so what was the provenance of the model, and what was the provenance of the data that informed the model, and all that kind of stuff. So if you actually read the data science literature at the moment, there are these fairly elementary and not very sophisticated attempts at data governance, trying to solve all the problems that Frank actually addressed 30 years ago. And so in the work that I'm doing and my colleagues, and I'm been dragging all of my record-keeping friends into this work because, in fact, the record keepers and archivists don't have a voice in that world, really. And trying to introduce all of this, So when you have a thing and it's created and it's captured into a system and it's organised in some sort of way and it's pluralised into a model that goes and makes decisions, well, that's pure continuum theory. We understand how that works, and we understand how it should work, and we understand the pitfalls of doing it badly and all of that kind of thing. So I think there's... I'm going to keep referencing the 1990s papers and more modern ones, and because I think that it's in some ways as relevant or more relevant today than it was perhaps 25 years ago.
It reminds me, there was an irony when I was writing this of I'm going very frank now, but Derrida's archival theory, archival fever, and that desire to get to the source. And I don't come from an IT background, so I was shocked when I found out that people would consider not citing something because it was 10 years old. I'd be citing something that's 150 years old because that's the source, so you go back to the source to understand the concept, and then you, like the archaeology of knowledge, you then follow, well, I guess it's more the genealogy, but you follow that evolution through. So,
I think that we're probably total converts on the panel, and so no doubt biased, but I would like to advocate to the faculty that this is a really rich and embedded way of thinking about information that really opens things up. And I think I don't like to say the legacy of Frank because that kind of puts it all into the past, but this is vibrant stuff which really informs practice as well as giving a rich conceptual base to explore a whole lot of different things. But I know we're on time. I'm getting flashy messages saying I'm over time. So with that, I think we'd best conclude, but I'd like to first of all thank our panellists for such a, well, I found stimulating discussion. And wish you well into the future and keep on advocating, folks. So thank you to you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to give our thanks to the faculty for organising the Whyte Lecture and how lovely it is to be in person and online. Sorry, online people. But the faculty has got a wonderful array of people supporting this event, and in particular I'd like to acknowledge Penny and Victoria and Ankit and Josh, who did the technology support, Hashita and Kalani and Michaela have been the front of house, so I'd like to give our thanks to those as well, and if you'd just join me in that. This lecture was recorded and will be available online, I think, pretty quickly. So we will make sure that that link goes out to people here and also for our online colleagues. And for those of you who are attending in person, there's a celebration and a continuing nibbles, eats and conversation to be had until 8:30. So enjoy. Thank you.